Hope we're all caffeinated. It's mid-afternoon. Welcome to the second panel of our conference on religion and the environment, moving from values to impact. I think you'll agree we had an excellent session just now, and we're coming off some informal conversation. Because there's some folks here who couldn't be with us earlier, I thought I'd just give a brief overview of the overall project, very brief, building on my colleague Safwan's excellent introduction. So this is an ongoing project, very much a work in progress, born out of a collaboration between Qatar Foundation, which works closely with our campus in Doha, and Georgetown and the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which I direct. And the goal, as the title of the conference suggests, is to think in new ways, given the urgency of a climate crisis, to really think in new creative ways together about how to elevate the voices of faith communities around the world, within their own communities, but also within the wider public and political sphere. No easy task, as we already discussed this afternoon. Georgetown is a Catholic and Jesuit university. Qatar Foundation is very much embedded in the Islamic world. We thought we'd start with Christian and Islamic perspectives, but as you could see with David's participation on that first panel, we want to expand the conversation at least to the Abrahamic traditions and beyond. The members of the working group, participants in the conference, have been discussing these issues over about a year, and we'll have another session tomorrow, just to let you know that this is part of an ongoing project. And we're really grateful that you're accompanying us at this really important juncture, our first public event of what we hope will be a multi-year project moving into the future. So that's just a little bit of the context about how we all got here. And as you know, we've got an exciting panel around a new document, Mizan, a covenant for the earth, which is so exciting that it came up a few times in the first panel. This is a statement drafted officially by a dozen or so Islamic scholars. Aude is here, Fakhruddin is here, so we're in the presence of some of the authors of the statement. It's a statement that was launched in February at a meeting of UN environmental ministers in Nairobi, Kenya, and had some press echo. Not a lot, there's a lot of other things going on in the world. But it's a statement that's here for the long run, and it's incredibly important. Those of us in the Christian Catholic world and beyond are, of course, familiar with Pope Francis's encyclical letter, Laudato Si', which dates from 2015. When we were putting together this project, Laudato Si' was in the background, and we were careful to juxtapose it with existing statements by Muslim scholars about the environment. But now, less than a year into the project, we have this incredible document. It runs to 100 pages. We put a 2-page summary out there. I hope some of you have picked it up. But we're not going to assume everyone's familiar with all the contents. So part of the purpose of this panel is to address the content and the significance of the statement. But then we also want to move on to whether and how it matters, how it can be part of this wider effort to bring religious voices into the conversation in a more focused way. And there I just want to begin by recalling the useful distinctions that Willis made in our earlier panel, for those of you who were here, as we wrestle with the paradox, the fact that religious communities that make up, by some counts, 80% of humanity have had a relatively limited impact on the evolution of this issue. As David reminded us, there has been impact, and it's unfolding before our eyes. But the crisis gets worse, and I'm sure we agree there's a lot more ground we could cover, those of us who are part of religious communities. And Willis laid out 3 hypotheses, if you like. One is the nature of our political systems or economic systems, that they're just structural reasons why we're on this train and we're barreling forward toward climate disaster, and it really doesn't matter what religious, I'm paraphrasing you, Willis, what religious or other communities do. A second hypothesis is a moral failure of religious communities themselves. David pointed out on the earlier panel, there are good reasons perhaps for the lack of impact, internal divisions within religious communities, theological differences, the fact that people join religious communities often from birth and they don't think that they're joining a pressure group for this or that. Those are all very legitimate concerns. In a way, our panel is going to address the third hypothesis and relate to the other two. But the third hypothesis, as I understood it, is that religious communities are latecomers, if you like, to this political and policy game because our religious traditions, speaking broadly, were formulated, articulated, evolved in a different historical era where the idea of climate crisis, the idea of limits on the environment didn't enter into the imagination. That there are resources in those traditions, and we'll be talking about Al-Mizan and the Islamic tradition in particular, but that there has to be, and there have been, and there must continue to be reflections at the intersection of the tradition and its overarching values on the one hand, and the issues that we're grappling with, the very real issues of climate crisis. So Laudato Si is just one example. There are many other examples within the Christian tradition. I just mentioned Laudato Si, and we may focus on that because it's the most high profile. But to have this document within the Islamic tradition so carefully constructed, beautifully constructed, so rich in its content and its reflections, not just on the values, but also on the context we're facing, not just on nature, but on the social dimension, not just on politics in the big picture, but on what the individual believer and small communities can do, is really a tremendous blessing. So like you all, I look forward to our conversation. Why don't I introduce our four speakers very briefly, and then we'll get things going. So to my left is Al-Jayoussi, who's currently head of innovation and technology management at Arabian Gulf University in Bahrain. He's previously worked as an international consultant around issues of energy, water, and the environment, and has served as vice president for science and research at the Royal Scientific Society of Jordan. As you'll hear, he speaks flawless English in part because he has a PhD in urban planning and policy analysis from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Next to him is Sevim Kalyonju, the executive director of Green Muslims. She's involved with multiple local climate action groups here in the DC area and is dedicated to helping educate youth about the importance of environmental awareness for spiritual, mental, and physical well-being. She holds a Bachelor of Science from Georgetown University. Is that the School of Foreign Service? Yeah. So welcome back. And a master's degree from the University of Chicago, and has worked in the nonprofit sector for many years. Great to have you here. Laurel Kearns is professor of ecology, society, and religion at Drew University in New Jersey, where she's taught since 1994. Her research is focused on religious involvement in ecological issues and movements, with a particular focus on environmental justice, climate change, and food issues. She is co-founder of the Green Seminary Initiative and serves on the board of the Parliament of World Religions. And finally, friend and colleague Munjid Murad, assistant professor in world religions and intercultural studies at the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. His research interests include Islam, Christianity, mysticism, and the natural environment. He holds a Master of Environmental Management, okay, that's important, from Yale, and is completing doctoral work in comparative religion with a focus on religion and nature at Harvard Divinity School, and as was mentioned earlier, he has served as an academic coordinator for our group. So grateful to have you all here. We'll do 2 rounds, and then we'll throw it open for a wider discussion. The first round, as we've discussed amongst us, will focus on the content of the document to some degree, but really its significance. And in your case, Auda, you can also give us a sense of the genesis of the document and how it was put together.
Thank you. Well, basically, Al-Mizan was an effort to contribute to a global discourse from the faith community in terms of environmental stewardship. It does not intend to present solutions, but rather to present some questions for co-creation and for open innovation, for a new narrative about human stewardship and the contribution of human civilization to saving the planet. There was more than one initiative. There was a declaration for climate change before that, and there were different initiatives. The uniqueness of Al-Mizan is to try to have a critique of the current development paradigm and to make a distinction between development versus growth, and to rethink the idea, the metrics for development and what constitutes progress, and try to redefine what constitutes happiness, what constitutes prosperity, and can we propose prosperity without a growth paradigm, and also to try to address the issue of what we call eco-cosmic intelligence. So we are not alone in this universe. We are part of a huge cosmology, and the creation for both the human and cosmos moved through the same journey. So the notion of trying to expand human empathy, or what we call eco-cosmic intelligence, that we are part of this cosmos, we are not alone, and we are accountable. We are stewards. So the metaphor, we are stewards and guardians rather than hunters. So a shift of metaphor is critical. So this was basically the idea of Al-Mizan, to call for action, to rethink the paradigm, and to try to bring a convergence between the faith community.
Thanks. And could you say a little more, maybe give a couple of examples of key passages or key concepts that are developed within the document? Yeah.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with 4-level analysis. We call it causal layered analysis. So if you look at the tip of the iceberg, what we see, the litany layer, we see there's a dichotomy between, there's a problem between population versus resources, what we call the Club of Rome, limits to growth. We see this idea of what constitutes wealth and the idea of money, how money is generated, and you can create more money through debt, the banking system or the IMF or the World Bank. So there is interesting paradoxes in terms of the idea of wealth creation and debt, the idea of the cycles of financial crises every once in a while. So this is what we see in the litany, the idea of population and resources, and the idea of the paradoxes in terms of development versus growth. So growth for the sake of growth is a recipe for failure. So we need to rethink different notions of public goods, different ideas of public assets or our natural capital, how we can rethink of our natural capital, and also the mental model of how our natural capital underpins our social capital and financial capital. So it's embedded, 3 embedded circles rather than 3 overlapping circles. So this is the litany. If you go down, the second layer is about systems, structures, and metrics. GNP or GDP is not the right metrics to measure progress, the health and wealth of societies. So we need different metrics to measure happiness, wealth of nations. So that's why there is some pitfall of capitalism, and how we can rethink of a moral economy or a sharing economy, or what we call now circular economy, that will ensure the wealth and health of nations. So this is at the systems layer. If you go deeper, a lower level of worldviews. So in terms of worldviews, we have 3 paradigms that were dominating the Muslim community. One is about fatalism, end of history, end of time, apocalyptic view. And another model is about fatalism or conspiracy theory. There is always conspiracy, whether it's climate change or whether it's any other issue, it's social. And there is another one emerging with the Generation Z. It's basically about rationalism and pragmatism. So how we move the three dominant worldviews from fatalism or conspiracy theory to more of a rational, pragmatic solutions to climate change. And part of the worldview is not about quick fixes, or we call it in engineering end-of-pipe solutions. So the solution to climate change is not about carbon emissions. Maybe you are engaging in the wrong debate. It's not about having an electric car or changing the bulb. It's beyond that. It's about healing human civilization. So we need to rethink the core issue and to engage in the right debate of what constitutes progress and what constitutes human prosperity. So this is part of the challenge in terms of worldviews between the three dominant mental models. If you go down in terms of the lower level, it's about the narrative, the story, or the metaphor. In Islam, we believe that God is the creator, humans are stewards, guardians, and witnesses. And we are part of the median community. The median community is part of a continuum of all Abrahamic religions. So Islam is not a new religion, not a new way of life, but rather a continuum. So part of this narrative, we believe that there is no scarcity in resources. There is also abundance. Mizan. Mizan means basically it's a balance. It's biqadar, that it's in the right of proportion. And when you talk about cosmology in Surah Al-Rahman, I'll speak in Arabic for those people. You say, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعْهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانَ. That Allah created the entire universe with mizan, with balance. So there is a balance at cosmological level. There is balance between nation state, and there is balance between individual domain. So 3 layers of balance that need to be kept in order to ensure good governance and good life. So in order to define sustainability, we need to define what constitutes good life. Good life in Arabic is hayat tayyiba. So hayat tayyiba, it's about having future generation, about good food, ta'am tayyib, good food, good city. So it's about future generation, a good city, good food. It's all part of what we call hayat tayyiba, or good life. So we need to rethink the idea of abundance versus scarcity. There is no scarcity. Indeed, there is abundance. If there is no greed, there is no greed. And also we need to rethink the idea of definition of the core issue of existential threat about climate change. It's about healing human civilization. This is the core issue. So it's not about self-interest group. I don't like to see the faith community as a self-interest group, that like those green movement who are just trying to save the whales or save butterflies. It's beyond that. It's about saving human civilizations. And also, it's about the narrative that there is convergence, there is oneness between human security and environmental security. They are inseparable. So even this interesting verse in the Quran which says, if you destroy one human life, if you end one human life, as if you are ending the entire humanity. وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. If you add life, if you protect one life, one single life, that means you are protecting the entire humanity. So the human life is sacred, and we are part of nature. We are not observers. We are part of environment. We are we're not alien species. So I think the idea is how we can promote this narrative in terms of the faith community, especially with the Generation Z, since they suffer from nature deficit disorder. And they suffer from human blind spots. How we can overcome this nature deficit disorder and human blind spots, and also ecological amnesia. We need to overcome all these problems, systemic problems, especially with future generations. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. You've really given us a sense of the richness of the document, its various layers, how it relates to the Islamic tradition, and we'll go deeper into that, but in a language that's very accessible. And I think if you read the document, I encourage you all to do so, you find a very, I would say, original and creative critique of the current world system that can easily be translated into other religious registers, into a secular register. And we'll come back to sort of how a document like this and everything behind it might fit into an interreligious frame as well. But before we do that, let's hear from our other colleagues. Sevim, as an activist who's on the ground, if you like, working these issues with diverse communities, how does the significance of the document look like to you, and are there specific elements of the content that you would highlight?
start with the content. I have to say it was quite a relief to read the document and find out that the way we've been presenting our message all these years was not crazy. When you're looking into your own faith and speaking to your faith communities with an interpretation that has not been widely spoken, it can be really scary at times. And I think for the first few years that I was with Green Muslims, I actually wasn't daring to say these things. Then I started meeting other Muslims who gave me their support. And we started presenting these key points about what Islam teaches that relates to what our proper relationship with nature should be. And that is exactly what this document starts off with. The introductory chapter is about the core Islamic teachings that relate to the human responsibility towards and relationship with nature. And so I wanted to touch on a few of those because I'm used to talking about them. Although I will note that the document goes into far more detail than we do and even touches upon some slightly different translations of terms as well. So the Arabic language, of course, is very rich, and when we want to use an English word, there are many options. If I have time, I'll have to tell you my story about growing up understanding Khalifa to mean vicegerent and not knowing what a vicegerent was. But first of all, my impressions about the document. The similar topics were a relief. We start everything with the introduction to the concept of Tawheed, the oneness of God. Or at least that's how it's defined. God is one, that is Tawheed. But in a broader sense, that oneness expands. So if only one created everything, the humans, the other animals, the plants, the rocks, the dirt, the water, then all of us are also united by that source. We are also one. We are one in servitude to our creation. We are interconnected, and we are all dependent on that one. We humans have tended over more recent history to separate ourselves from nature as if it's here for us, but we are actually a part of it. It is all God's creation, and we are one of God's creation. So starting everything with that general understanding that everything comes from God takes us into the second point, which is that everything matters. Everything has a purpose. The rock, the ant, the mosquito, even the things we don't like. God doesn't create anything without purpose. So everything that God created has purpose, and it has rights too. Not just the humans have rights here on this earth, but all of God's creation has rights. And that's what we humans have to remember, because we are impeding on the rights of the rest of God's creation. But these are core Islamic teachings that just for many years got overlooked in relation to our responsibilities here on earth towards non-humans. One of my favorite themes is the concept of ayat. Most Muslims know that an ayat in the Quran is a chapter, but the literal translation of the term ayat is sign. And there is an Islamic understanding that we have the book of the Quran, but we also have the book of the earth. And while there are ayat to read in the Quran, there are also ayat to read in nature. These ayat in nature are the signs of God in nature. And so I found this to be an excellent tool dealing with younger people who may be questioning their relationship to their faith, or those who look at a translation of the Quran and don't feel comfortable with what it says in whatever their language is. There are other ways to read God's messages, and one of them is through nature, by seeing the signs, and those signs all reflect God. What are the signs? All of creation, the plants, the animals, even us. All of the signs in nature reflect God. And so one of God's books is the earth itself. And this was also touched upon and expanded upon quite a bit in this document. Of course, we have to look at the name of the document, a Mizan. Mizan, I think, is generally defined as equilibrium in the work. We usually refer to it as balance. God creates everything in balance. Nature was created in balance. Any imbalance in nature today is our own doing, and we are obligated to try to correct it, which then takes me into my final point in regards to terminology that was discussed in this first chapter. Why are we obligated to correct the damage we've done? Because we, humankind, are the Khalifa of the earth. And I really want to tell the story.
Yeah,
I once
please.
asked so I grew up in Alabama. I was raised Muslim, but without a major Muslim community around me. I did not go to Sunday school like a lot of kids do nowadays. I remember once asking my father, my father was saying to me, we are the Khalifa of the earth. I'm like, what's Khalifa mean? And he says, vicegerent. And I was, I was a really smart kid. I didn't like admitting that I didn't know what things meant. And so I just nodded and went on with it. But now we are expanding that definition because, again, the Arabic term means so much more than vicegerent, and vicegerent is not a word that we use in everyday English, so don't bother with it. One of those definitions, two of those definitions, is steward or caretaker. Islam teaches that humans are the stewards of the earth. Now, there are some debates about this translation and whether or not we should be taking responsibility or just not doing damage. But one term that comes up in the document is also shepherd. And that reminder that we have a responsibility, especially now that we've upset the balance of nature. God expects us to take care of things, to not do harm. We are the Khalifa, and we, by the way, does not mean Muslims, it means humankind. The fact that we are the Khalifa of the earth is something that we need to re-reflect upon and start following through with those responsibilities. Some have argued, some Muslim scholars have argued that we shouldn't claim that responsibility because that's what leads to the damage, but the damage is done. I personally think we need to claim the responsibility and start trying to correct it as much as possible for us. There are also other references that we're used to sharing through our presentations with Green Muslims. Waste is a sin in Islam, but it's the way we live right now. We can't get away from it. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, gave so many hadith, so many sayings, examples about the proper way to treat the plants and the animals. They matter. They have rights. Even an ant, we're not supposed to just stomp on and ignore. But there were a couple things that resonated very deeply with me in this first chapter. One of them was the importance placed on simple exposure to nature. There are multiple references throughout the document of the importance of just getting people, especially children, out into nature. And this is something that I believe in very deeply. Again, I grew up in Alabama. There was no masjid in my town there is now, by the way, but there wasn't back then. My masalla, the place that I felt closest to God for prayer, was in the woods. And that's why this understanding came naturally for me. I believe it's inherent in the fitra of humanity, the closeness and the purity that we're born with, to feel a closeness to nature and to feel God's presence in nature and to see the signs of God in nature. And especially now, as people of any past faith tradition may be feeling some pull away from their faith, this might be a way of connecting us all at a level of faith, but it will also have positive implications for the environment. And finally, there is one point that was made that I never hear in presentations about the environment, be it faith-based or not. And it was brought up in Auda's earlier talk. This direct statement, and this is what impresses me so much about this document, the fact that the scholars were willing to say this directly. And I'm going to quote it because I admire their ability to just say it flat out. In looking for solutions, humanity has been tackling the symptoms more than the causes of the crisis. I think about electric cars nowadays and how we're supposed to, or alternative energy. How about less energy rather than alternative energy? Why is that never brought up as a potential solution? Continuing with the quotation, there are two fundamental issues so close to us that we take them almost entirely for granted. They need to be examined if we are to aim to restore Earth's systems to some state of equilibrium. Mizan. The first of these is our attitude to the natural world itself, which we have defined as a resource to be exploited. The second issue is not only very closely linked to the first, but also feeds it. It is money. And it goes on a bit later. In fact, money is like a virus that eats into the fabric of the natural world every time we use it. And this is where I feel the most hope in younger, especially college-age students at this point in time, questioning our current capitalist system and its impact on the environment. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much. Laurel, can you share some of your impressions of the document and your sense of its significance?
First of all, I just want to say what a wonderful document it is. And as a teacher in a Protestant seminary, I already teach Laudato Si, and to put these two together will be just a wonderful tool. And I imagine for those of you in the audience who know Laudato Si, you've already heard so many of the parallels. And I have, charts of like, here's what the Laudato Si says, and here's what Al-Mizan says, but both begin with praise. We know Laudato Si is praise be, and we know, well, I was about to quote from the document, but of course that's when your phone goes out. But that's what the first lines of Al-Mizan are, about praise. And I want to emphasize that because with that praise comes awe and wonder. And we have lost that a lot, but our traditions have not. And if we don't love the creation, we don't mourn its loss. We don't mourn what we don't already love. And so the degradation of creation, if we're not already struck by the awe, the wonder, the magnificence, and our humbleness within it, then we don't, I always say in New Jersey, they don't care if another shopping mall takes out another Woods. It's like, oh, that brand will be closer to me. So, and there's a couple of ways even that it's said. And in Laudato Si, they quote the bishops of Japan, and I just love this language, that the task is to sense each creature singing the hymn of its existence. And Al-Mizan says, every creature knows its prayer. So you already brought that to our attention. These are not anthropocentric documents. They remind us constantly of our proper place in all of creation, and that it's not just about us. And so that's one of my other points that they both make, is that there are three fundamental relationships: our relationship to God, our relationship to each other, but the creation, the earth's relationship to God. And particularly in a Protestant context, they get so fixated on this human-God relationship, am I saved, that they completely forget that all of creation has a relationship with God also. And so both documents remind us of how creation sings praises to God, because that's in our scriptures. The other thing is that we know, for those of you who know St. Francis and the inspiration of St. Francis to Laudato Si, I was so inspired by Francis that my daughter's name is Claire Francis, and I have a statue of Francis in my office. But Francis talks about a community of kin. So it isn't just a stewardship relationship. It's a reminder, which we would hear time and time again from indigenous traditions, that we are in a fraternity, a community of kinships. And one of my favorite things from the Quran is, there is no animal but is a community like yourselves. Think of what that reminds us. And so I've had the opportunity of learning a lot about Islam from a former student who was one of the co-writers of this. And so I was just thrilled to see all these things, like all of the earth is a mosque. We should know that. Christianity started outdoors. It didn't start in churches. Of course, all the earth is a place to offer prayer. So those three fundamental relationships I really appreciate. And of course, then what both do is talk about an integral ecology. That is Pope Francis's term, not just his, the whole community that wrote Laudato Si. But both of them remind us that we can't talk about justice without talking about ecological wholeness. And we can't talk about environmental issues without talking about how human thriving and all of creation's thriving are wrapped up. And you've already heard that. I am really impressed with this document. Think about what it means right now in the Muslim world to critique fossil fuels and critique the economic order. Think about what it means in the world of Christianities to critique the economic order. And both of these documents mince no words in telling how that is the problem and that strong condemnation. And they both remind us creation is not here to serve human beings. It has its own existence, its own relationship. And Laudato Si, other living beings are not objects. So there are strong critiques of that utilitarian ethics that sort of says everything is here for what its use is to us. And I probably particularly focus on that, being within a Protestant setting where I think it's overemphasized in the tradition that creation is fallen. And so it's common to hear where it's fallen, you know, it doesn't have value until it's redeemed, everything's going to be redeemed in another world. And so what I find my students in that focus on fallenness, they think it gives permission to not care. Mm-hmm. And they don't realize that Martin Luther said, you can see God even in the tiniest grain of rice. So just like both Laudato Si and Mizan remind us of the presence of God throughout all the creation. And that's why I love that notion of ayat. And that is very similar, as you can imagine, to the Book of Nature tradition within Christianity, strongly recognized within Catholicism, but very influential in Protestantism. And I find my students have forgotten that, yes, it is okay to see God present in creation. That is not worshiping the creation, as I was taught as an evangelical when I was younger. And so I think those are the three things I really want to bring forward. I can talk maybe later about a couple of key differences, but those are the three. I have, as I said, long list of just the wonderful resonances of these two important documents.
Thank you, Laurel, and thank you for alluding to the fact that underneath a lot of the commonalities in language and assessments of the global situation and the drama of the climate change crisis, there are shared values, but there are also some important theological differences within and across our communities, and how we approach creation itself, whether it's fallen to begin with or not, is one of those. Munjid, what are some of your reflections on the document, the content, but also the significance?
Thanks for having me, Vito. Just a quick correction, I have finished my doctorate.
Yeah,
I know. Biography,
I was reading an older bio.
Doctor.
Fortunately. No longer enslaved. All but dissertation, abd in Arabic. All but dissertation means slave in Arabic, abd, the acronym for all but dissertation. Good. So emancipated. So I speak as a scholar of Islam and the environment. The Al-Mizan document there's a history leading up to the Al-Mizan document. I mean, Auda can speak much more, can give us a much deeper explanation, many more details about the formation of the document itself, but the general ambiance is one of an inherited tradition that has been very ecologically friendly, the Islamic tradition. It has developed sciences of nature in light of the sacred. Chemistry has its origins, to a large extent, in Islamic alchemy, in which the cosmos was seen in light of the sacred. Same with algebra, same with geometry, and so forth. These sciences of nature that were theocentric, that were oriented towards the sacred, and that saw value in the cosmos spiritually, an inherent spiritual value in the cosmos. And that is the Islamic tradition that modern Muslims inherit. However, there's a rupture that has taken place in modern times with the secularization of education the secularization of the cosmos through the adoption of secular sciences, and everything from secular entertainment that just secularizes, desanctifies reality. So there's been this rupture, yet we've received nonetheless the Quran, which kind of reads like the Psalms. I mean, just as a theme of the Quran, that everything praises God's glory, and that everything has its prayer. The wings, birds with their wings spread, and every creature walking on the earth have their own canonical prayers, their own salat, the 5 canonical prayers, 5 daily prayers, canonical prayers the Muslims do. That same word is used to describe every other creature. That they all have their own form. They all have their own sharia in Islamic cosmology. Their own sharia being body of law and revelation. Yet there's this rupture. And what Al-Mizan does is it brings, it emphasizes this environmental dimension of the Quran. There are so many more verses on nature than there are legalistic verses, incomparably, within the Quran. It mentions the example of the Prophet Muhammad, and it even goes one step further, and it mentions the possibility of traditional means of protecting the environment, of interacting with the environment. And I wanted to focus on one particular theme, and that is that of Tawheed. I think if you were to focus on any Islamic doctrine to describe the Islamic religion, if you ask, as a scholar of religion, I've been warned not to make general statements, avoid generalities. But if you can make one general statement about Islamic doctrine, from Indonesia to West Africa to Nigeria, if you ask, generally speaking, a Muslim scholar from the Far East to the Far West of the Islamic world, what Islamic doctrine is about, in one word, they would answer Tawheed. And if they were to say something else, you would say, what about Tawheed? They say, oh yes, that's right, Tawheed. Tawheed being the oneness of God. And the Arabic word entails a realization, it has the connotation of realizing the oneness of God. The document mentions how this Tawheed goes beyond just mentioning that there is one God, there aren't two thrones beyond the heavens, but moving beyond that there's an interrelatedness of all things in reality, reflecting Tawheed on the earthly plane. We as individuals cannot live lives fully independently of our environments, let's say independently of our societies. We live in webs of coexistence. Moving beyond that is to say social classes, income classes. You cannot just tend to one income class and not tend to the other. Ultimately, that proves unsustainable. And a reflection of Tawheed on the corporeal level, also between human beings and nature, that you cannot tend to just one species among all the species of the cosmos and not tend to the others, or just live with just in the pursuit of one species' happiness and not of others. So this interconnectedness emphasized in light of the oneness of divine reality, reflected as an interconnectedness between all creatures in this level of reality. And to take that point further, and I was glad to see this in the document, that there's essentially this interrelatedness and this oneness implies a theocentricity. And this theocentricity goes beyond, theocentric being oriented towards God, as opposed to, say, anthropocentric, we've heard that term, oriented towards human beings, from the Greek anthropos, human, and theocentric being oriented towards God. This theocentricity meant that everything was oriented towards the sacred within, and not meant just in the past tense, but also in the present tense. wherever traditional sciences exist, our traditional ways of living in a civilization. And so I was glad to see that moving beyond just quoting Quran and quoting the example of the Prophet, there was mention of traditional ways of living oriented towards the sacred. Traditional architecture, agriculture, but traditional architecture would apply as well. Traditional agriculture, traditional water ducts and things to that effect. The environmental preservation systems rooted in the Islamic traditions, such as the Hima and the system, the Harim system, conservatory and preservation systems, the Awqaf, Waqf, the Awqaf, which is the endowment system that protects the environment, which is by nature long-term thinking, and endowment is long-term thinking and necessary for such a long-term problem as the environmental crisis. So Tawheed, moving beyond just Tawheed as we normally speak about it, to include also Tawheed of disciplines. Everything, a oneness of disciplines of in life oriented towards the sacred. And this was actually just final point. This is I think, we have very little literature in the Islamic world on the environment compared to the Christian world today, which has much more on religion and the environment, much more incomparably. Even though the response to the environmental crisis starts with a Muslim voice, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, back in the 1960s, prior to even Lynn White Jr., who highlighted the spiritual roots of the environmental crisis, spiritual and intellectual roots. Despite that, we don't have much. So it's a breath of fresh air. So it's a relief to see a document on Islam and the environment published, and also with so many hands behind it.
Thank you, Munjid, and thanks for explicating a bit that core concept of Tawheed, which, as you note, is not a static concept. It's not a oneness that's there. It's a process of becoming, of interdependence, dynamic interdependence. That's a really useful concept in so many ways. Before we open it up for questions and broaden the conversation, I want to bring it back to the core question behind this conference, which is how we move from values to impact. And in the context of Al-Mizan, how can this document make a difference? It won't make a difference as a document. As we know, there's so many declarations that get published. If they're lucky, they get put on bookshelves these days, disappear into the ether. After every big interfaith meeting, there's another document published that doesn't really have a lasting impact. I think this will be different, but it will depend on what people do with it. So how do you think about impact? And since you were there, Aude, throughout the process, how did the group think about impact? How do you think about impact? Where do we go from here with a document like this?
Well, I think it's a pretty challenging question. I mean, there is complexity.
Yeah.
And perhaps I use the notion of, in physics, the butterfly effect. I think looking at the interconnectedness of everything in this universe, I think local action, I think we need to work at three levels. One is we need to globalize consciousness, we need to regionalize vision, and we need to localize benefits. So I think this type of, or what I call it, conscious evolution, how we can have some sort of new consciousness about our role as stewards, as witnesses, and we have responsibility. One idea of moving from one loop learning to double loop learning to narrative learning. I think in Surah Al-Rum, I'll say it in Arabic and then I'll translate in English, verse 41 in Surah Al-Rum, which says, ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعض الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون, which says basically imbalance is happening on land and sea because of human-made interventions, but there is an opportunity for regaining balance if we rethink our model. لعلهم يرجعون. So the idea of there is no doom and gloom scenario. There is an opportunity to heal the planet. There is an opportunity to have global commons. And what I call in Surah Ali Imran, there is interesting terminology which I like, which says a common word, kalima sawa. Let's agree, all people of the book, let's agree on a common word. قل يا أهل الكتاب تعالوا إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم. All people of the book, let's agree on a common word. There is a common homeland for us, but let's agree on a common word. A common word, kalima sawa, which is basically there will be no intellectual hegemony, no human hegemony, and we are exercising what we call ecocide. I mean, there is a homicide, there is genocide, and there is an ecocide. There is a global ecological extension, but we need to make sure this part of oneness is this oneness between human security and ecological security. We don't want to look at human security as part of an ivory tower, because justice, I think in terms of impact, we need to harness the power of networks, we need to harness the power of narrative, and we need to harness the power of now. The power of now, that every little action matters, every word matters, and every networking matters. I think there is opportunity to harness the youth generation and civil society, besides policymakers, in terms of Generation Z, especially with harnessing the social media and having new narrative about who we are, what do we stand for, and who pays what and why. The idea of commodification culture, commodification of humans, and commodification of everything is not helping us to move forward into a humane society. Now there is part of the hegemony of the superpowers is expanding territory. We need to stay away from expanding territory to expanding empathy. How we can move from expanding territory to expanding human empathy. And part of this new narrative, new consciousness, is that three pillars we have to have: reason, faith, and empathy. With AI, with the emergence of what I call it weapons of math destruction, with these weapons of math destruction, or some people call it math destruction, some people call it, basically it's a software for plagiarism, this type of AI. And how we can overcome these weapons of math destruction, because it's not intelligent, it's not natural. And how we can move forward into a new era of harnessing empathy and moving away from idea of hegemony and domination into celebrating diversity and unity within diversity. Although the idea of oneness, there is unity within diversity. You cannot have a forest with one species. Part of celebration of diversity is part of sustaining a human civilization.
Thank you. And in that very rich answer, I heard the importance of awakening the enthusiasm of young people.
Exactly, civil society.
And we're at a university, we know how important that is. And Sevim, that relates to your work too. Can you say a bit about impact from where you're sitting?
Yeah. Thank you for that opportunity. I like to think that there are already Muslims out there trying to spread this message, and it's not a new message. It's just finally now being brought together in an official, respectable document, and that has great strength. At Green Muslims and other Muslim American environmental organizations, these topics are already being shared, but they're being shared on small scale. And now we have a document that can be sent out. And sure enough, when we advertised this talk, I made sure to include a link to the document because it is out there for everyone. And so I think that's where the biggest impact is going to be, that there is a document, a respectable document, written by religious scholars. Our community needs that. And it's readable. I think the layperson from a religious and a scientific perspective can still understand it all. And I really appreciated how it was written. Through Green Muslims, we started a very basic level of just trying to encourage an appreciation for nature. This is where the empathy comes in. I think of it more as a love. We take people outside and try to show the beauty. And from that appreciation comes respect and concern. And then we talk about what's happening to the environment. And from there, concern and responsibility is expected to grow. Now there is a respectable document that can be shared beyond just our family participants. And where I really see the biggest impact initially is getting this to our imams and our sheikhs, our teachers, the ones who speak at the Friday prayers, and getting this message into the weekly experiences of the community in general. Because again, the points are not radical. They just are not common right now. And the nonprofit organizations sometimes have trouble connecting with the heads of the religious communities. And now we can just say, hey, look at this. This is what the scholars say Islam is teaching. Can you integrate this into your Friday khutbahs, your Jummah khutbahs? And yeah, it's, I'm honored to have one of our community leaders here today because he is good about working with our organization. Imam Johari is the best. Mm-hmm. But now for those who haven't had time to meet with me, for example, because we have a lot of issues to deal with, now I can send them a document and say, read this off and on when you have a chance, and see if you can integrate this into your teachings. If you have any questions, reach out. Green Muslims is here to talk with you. But I'm a teacher at a primary level, taking the kids out into nature to experience as well as learn. And now I can mention this. Muslim kids in the US can grow up knowing that this document exists, and it's something that they can learn as they mature, and they can share it with their parents. And now that we have an adult program with Green Muslims, this will be one lesson of our program. So, a part of me is like, we were saying all this already. It's nothing new, but we needed it. We needed it to be an official document that can be shared, and hopefully it will be well respected, well received, and the message will just move faster, because things have been changing. I've seen a silver lining to the whole experience with the COVID pandemic. It's gotten many, many people outside, including within the Muslim community, and it's gotten families concerned about environmental exposure for their children, like they want them to be exposed to nature, they need that time in nature, and with that comes a growing concern for the well-being of the environment. So this is coming at an ideal time to share the message with the Muslim community as a whole, throughout the whole world, and just move the process a little bit faster. So if we can get our leaders to share it, it'll move even faster. In the meantime, we'll keep sharing it, and we'll see how fast it goes.
Thank you. Laurel, any thoughts on impact? Yeah.
Within our traditions in their huge spectrum, most adherents think they are following the faith. And so to have a document that says, maybe you've gotten a little too accustomed to the secular world or to the dominant economic order, is really important. And I know for my students, it works a lot better. For them, they learn a tremendous amount in reading about Islam that helps them see their own and critique their own traditions. And so to help people be able to critique their own tradition, the way they practice it, is much more effective than our telling them they should. We know that telling people they should care hasn't worked. But at the same time I say that, I'm a sociologist, and I know that people are very good at saying they value this while they still do this. They don't see the contradictions. And so I think the task before us is quite great. And even as I am so excited about the ideas and the critiques within these documents, I think it's those of you who are the activists, who are on the ground with the communities, who are constantly saying, we are called to do this. We are called to do this. So don't depend on the imams. Don't depend on the priests and the pastors. It's the empowerment of the people who will make a difference. And hopefully, I'm a bit pessimistic at the moment, Nazi Germany was one of the most educated countries in the world as fascism rose, and watching what's happening in our own country. But I'm a sociologist who believes very much in what communities do. If you start at your community and you keep trying to expand that, that may be one of our better hopes, because I don't have much hope anymore in government agreements. Sorry to be the pessimist.
Thank you. And maybe, Munjid, I have a question for you before we turn to the audience. And Fakhruddin, I'm going to ask you first to reflect a bit because you were part of the drafting process. But Munjid, as a scholar of both Islam and of Christianity as it relates to environmental questions, the interfaith angle here is interesting. The document itself, I did a little word search, doesn't include the word interfaith or interreligious. It doesn't reference, as far as I could tell, I may have missed it, Laudato Si or other documents from other faiths. That's not a criticism. I mean, the beauty of this document is it goes deep on the Islamic tradition. To your point, Laurel and Sevim, you've got to mobilize the community from the ground up. This is a long-term process of socialization into a new way of looking at the world. At the same time, we want to be able to throw these documents together as part of an interfaith effort to raise the voices of religious communities. How do you think about impact, given the interfaith challenge and the fact that documents like this are so grounded in particular traditions?
Well, for one, I think it seems to me, Auda, you would know more about what led to the drafting of this document. But it seems to me that Laudato Si had an impact on the general discourse in the Islamic world concerning the environment, and that Muslims wanted to say, "Oh, we're green too. We too." And so you had the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change in Turkey, now Turkiya, and the Al-Mizan document. One Quranic explanation for the diversity of religions is that peoples of different religious communities may vie with each other in charitable deeds. Mm-hmm. And you see that at play over here. Yes, we're green too, so to speak. And here, I think the Muslims, and I think generally people, because everybody would benefit if there's something, if the Muslims do something. But anyways, we would all benefit if Muslims were to learn from the Catholics here, in that in response to Laudato Si, you had the institutionalization of the message of Laudato Si. So for impact, my one word would be institutionalization. Centers, Laudato Si centers around the world, in Laudato Si primary school activities around the world. And if we could do something to that effect, an institutionalization of something on Islam and the environment, I think it would benefit Muslims and the world in general, because ultimately we're all going to breathe the same air, whether we're Catholic or Shiite or Sunni. We're all going to breathe the same air. So if one religious tradition's teachings gets institutionalized concerning the environment in a positive way, then it aids us all. And then just to take it one step further, I think something interfaith, Islam, Christianity, and the environment institutionalized would tend, so to speak, would, let's say, feed two birds with one hand, in that it tends to environmental issues and also the human ecosystems, so to speak, into religious issues.
Thank you.
Tom,
Yeah,
say
please
something
jump
on
in
that?
quickly. Yeah.
Because I didn't like that I ended on this more pessimistic note. I'm on the I'm on the board of the Parliament of World Religions, and I do this work of teaching global faiths because I think it makes a huge difference that we can work together in a world that wants to pit us against each other. We have one earth. If we don't work together, we don't have that.
Yeah.
So the interfaith possibilities here are what really, really excite me.
Thank you.
So thank you for...
All right, quickly, because we want to go to the audience.
Just one statement. I was invited this Ramadan in Dubai for the Future Museum, and most of the audience were coming from different religions, mainly Hinduism, and when I talk, basically there is agreement, there is convergence between what we say and in different religions, Abrahamic and Hinduism. And I think what was interesting is that people appreciated the notion in terms of change, Tom, which is basically you cannot compel change through fear. You can compel change through hope. And one interesting hadith by Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which says, even if it's the last day of this earth, and you have a small palm tree planted. So the idea of fatalism or end of history is not in line with the Islamic discourse. The idea of instilling a sense of hope, instilling a sense of optimism is a key to transform and to make strategic shift for the future.
Thank you.
Hope,
Thank you very
not
much.
fear.
Yeah, it's given the state of the world, that's a very important, if difficult, message for many to hear.
Absolutely.
So we have a roving mic or two. I'd like to give Fakhruddin a chance. You've listened to the panel. You also were part of the discourse and debate leading up to Al-Mizan. Is there anything that you would add to what you've heard here so far about Al-Mizan and its importance? Yeah.
One thing, the reflection of the importance of document like this is it will be take long influence. I should state my experience on learning the documents from Said Hussein Nasser. When I was young, I am the one who was influenced by him.
Mm-hmm.
I wish to see him here in this university because he's still here, I hope so. It's been translated from many languages. The scholarship of Said Hussein Nasser is influenced the Muslim world on regarding the environment. Secondly, the Harvard volume of Islam and ecology is so meaningful also, which is, I also try to translate some chapter to Bahasa Indonesia. This Al-Mizan should be translated to many languages. That's what the obsession should do for the first time. It should be in Hausa, it should be in Malay, Bahasa, Turkish already, and so many Islamic words adopted this document. Even voluntarily, we are based to translate this. This is what I'm thinking we should do for the first time to disseminate. However, there is some interest as modalities to translate it for the communities and Islamic organization, Islamic universities should refers to that because this will be a major document, very important. The second thing that we also have to refer to this document is also to appreciate the existing cultures of Islam and the practice of the Islamic, such as protecting rivers and forests. So the Hima and the Harim zone is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Your last point about respecting cultures of Islamic practice and how it relates to a document of principles is critical as we go forward. All right, we have some time for general conversation, questions from the audience, and a couple of mics. If you'd like to pose a question here, we'll start here and then. Yeah.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you.
Please
very
introduce
much.
yourself.
Oh, yeah, my name is Andrew Merritt. I teach in the classics department downstairs.
Uh-huh.
I think it's fair to say that the parts of the world that contribute the most to the climate crisis are the parts of the world that have been, over the past few centuries, affected most by anthropocentricity, humanist ideology. And it's difficult to convince people who implicitly understand the human species or themselves as individuals as the ultimate arbiters of the meaning of their lives, it's very difficult to convince them that they are stewards. And so how do people of faith, particularly in the Abrahamic religions, how do they even begin to have conversations with people who view themselves as not being responsible? I mean, that seems like the huge question,
Yeah.
the worldview question. How do Christians and Muslims attempt to share a better way, give people hope?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's very difficult. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thanks. Maybe I'll share a few thoughts and then we can throw it to the panel. I mean, one of the peculiarities, if you like, of this project is we're trying to work from within religious traditions at a time where certainly in the so-called West, religion is in a long-term process of decline in terms of its impact on the public sphere. It's still important enough to have an impact, and how to, in the case of Christianity, let's say, in the West, how to, if not maximize, improve that impact over time is one of our concerns, moving from values to impact. But we can't duck your challenge, which is how to bring the religious discourse, the religious traditions into wider conversations in the secular public sphere and translate, if possible, and I don't know if you can, and that's behind your question, ideas like stewardship or our common home, to use Pope Francis's phrase, from a religious, monotheistic in both cases, idiom into a wider secular register. I think it's possible. I think if you look at youth activism around climate change, there is something, there are not a lot of the terms we've been using here, but there's an underlying sense perhaps of the sacredness of nature, which is looking for a way to be articulated. But that will involve some translation on the part of religious traditions if they're to engage those seekers, among young people in particular, who sense that there's something being violated, some sense of creation for which we're responsible, but wouldn't think of it at all within an Abrahamic frame. So I think that's a real challenge you've identified. Other thoughts on this question? Yeah, Savin?
I definitely have some thoughts on it, although again, I work on a small scale. It may need to be changed to have greater impact. I take people outdoors, and I have two specific examples from my own experiences that just give me hope in nature as a way of connecting all of us, no matter what our faith or lack of faith might be, no matter what our political views might be. I once did an interfaith hike, and it was so interesting. There were not scholars leading this hike. There were just a bunch of us who put faith together with nature for ourselves, and there was a common theme, whether it was from the Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or in this case Buddhist tradition. It was how being in nature gave us a sense of a higher power. And at the end of this hike, and we introduced our different perspectives, again, at a personal level, and one of the participants said, well, I'm actually agnostic, borderline atheist, but that sense that you describe in nature is something that I feel too. And I was like, aha, we have our connection. I happen to call it God, but you can call it whatever you want, and we can connect on that. And now this is, again, a very personal thing about connection with nature, but how do people start to care about nature? Through that connection, through that love. So it can start at a very basic level. I mean, can we get the whole world out on a nature hike? I hope someday. But the other example I have is through the other work that I do, which is outdoor education that goes beyond an Islamic perspective, it doesn't touch upon an Islamic perspective. It's a secular program that I teach, and it even goes into issues like outdoor skills, which can be seen as survival skills, or Native American practices, depending on what your political perspective is. I get a full range of students in these programs of different political perspectives as well as religious perspectives. And we all connect over this love of being outdoors. maybe I feel like I need to protect it because it's my service to God. Maybe some of my students think, well, we need to have the forest so we can go hunting. But everybody still feels that need to have nature. So I actually feel like nature can now be this connection that goes beyond religion, goes beyond politics, if we can get people outside to experience this. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe not all people have this feeling, but I'm finding out that a lot more people do than realized it before.
Thank you. Aude?
Well, maybe just three main comments. One, I think the idea of a common word. How can we agree in a common word? Changing the mental model. Sometimes I use the notion of the distinction in classical physics between Newton and Einstein. The classical physics became obsolete because when you added a fourth dimension, which is time. I think now sustainability has three pillars: economy, society, and ecology. We need perhaps to rethink sustainability in a fourth dimension. And the fourth dimension could be culture, spirituality, governance, or human rights. So maybe part of transcending and transforming the mental model of sustainability is to think of the missing fourth dimension. I think Al-Mizan is trying to critique the current development model in order to help to co-create a new fourth dimension. So a common word, that's changing the mental model. I think the convergence of faith/science discourse, it's critical, because and now in quantum physics, I'm not an authority in quantum physics, but they talk about singularity, emergence, and entanglement. And the idea of there is a consciousness of the matter, and they can prove it mathematically. Whether you call it design, intelligent design, or whether you call it a consciousness of the matter or the electron, the word is not thing, it's not materia, it's articulate, it's intelligent, and it is alive. Shay in Arabic, it means, when they translated from Arabic to Greek, it's kai. They use kai. The idea is kai is shay, anything. So kai, basically, shay, everything is in a state of prayer, so when min shay illa yusabbih bihamdih. The idea of that everything is alive, intelligent, and articulate is critical to change the discourse. Finally, I think we in the scientific community or in the environmental movement, we need to simplify our jargon. Sometimes we talk different, very difficult language, even for our kids. They will not understand sustainability. Maybe we need to use the influencers, podcast, green Wikipedia, new maybe film by Al Gore or by one of our colleagues, the convenient to shift the inconvenient truth into the convenient truth. It's about the convergence between faith and science. So I think transforming this side of, I would say, having the spirituality dimension to sustainability can bring new dimensions for healing the planet and healing humanity.
Thank you.
Tom, can I?
Very quickly, and then we can get some more questions. Yeah.
I like to point out to my students that our three most intimate interactions with creation are breathing, drinking, and eating. And you'll notice in the description, I've added that I work on food issues and food justice issues, because people who may not see themselves as stewards or in any way responsible, they'll pay attention to what they're eating and what the consequences might be. And so I now teach a whole religion and foods class, and it reaches people that never would take any class I taught that had eco. And so I think and we know that the agricultural system is a huge part of the issue, and it's why I love teaching about Islam and Judaism, because they have food ethics that Christians don't see as articulated, but then start realizing. I mean, after all, what is the central Christian ritual? Is a meal.
Right.
So I think that's a place. I just ask them, how can you take communion if the wheat and the grapes are poisoned and everything dies and the workers develop? How can that be communion? So it's a different way of getting them to think, because it's appealing to their own self-interest in some ways.
Very quickly. So in response to your question, first, the other person has to want to hear and be open to another way of thinking. You can't put water into a container that has a lid on it. So the other person's open to you. Otherwise, it's just preaching to a wall. Like it doesn't do anybody any good. If the other person's open to it, you mentioned humanism. It's worth keeping in mind. It's worth just looking historically. The environmental crisis was not born until humanity rejected the sacred. The humanism doesn't mean you're a human being, I'm a human being, let's hold hands, sing kumbaya, I'm from the Middle East, you're from North America or something like that. Humanism means a move from a theocentric world to an anthropocentric world, to a human-centered world, denying the sacred, moving away from the superstition of religion to only human reason, so called superstition of religion. It was that, the denial of the sacred, which a civilization that denied the sacred, that gave birth to an imbalance of global proportions. And then speak to, from an Islamic point of view, I would say, speak to the fitrah of the person, because everybody has a fitrah. Fitrah being the primordial nature of a person. Everybody, generally speaking, people can feel the sacrality of nature. You don't even have to talk about from a very particular religious tradition. You can speak to the primordiality, the primordial nature of a human being in a similar way to Savim was saying just now.
All right, let's gather. We have a question over here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Jocelyn Cesari. I'm at the Berkley Center and part of this project. I found the back and forth between the audience and the panel very, very interesting and key, actually, because the panel is looking inward, meaning what are the resources within this particular tradition, Islamic tradition, that can respond to the contemporary challenge. While this debate is also happening in secular terms, and that was your question. And actually there are two extreme poles. The one you mentioned, anthropocentric, but there is the opposite, which is called deep ecology, where actually the stone, the animal, takes over the individual. And it would be interesting not only for the Islamic tradition, but for all the others, to try to get into this debate, because I don't think they are here yet. And sadly, the Christian tradition especially is seen on the side of the anthropocentric because of some particular voices among the Christian community. So how do we relocate this very rich theological thinking on responsibility, communal goal, and humankind within these two poles? Because if we don't do that, we're not going to talk to the young people, because most of them are moving now toward the extreme pole of deep ecology. And they are not thinking in this more religious, communal approach. So that
All right, thank you for that comment. Let's see, are there,
In the back.
in the back, we have a question here or a comment. Bruce?
Yeah, thanks. I have a very simple question. By the middle of the second talk, I was on Amazon.com to find out how I can get a hard copy of this. And I couldn't find it. And so I went to Google. I thought I'll find it there. I couldn't find it. So that's my simple question, is how can I get a hard copy of this so I can read it?
If you put into Google Al-Mizan Earth,
Earth Covenant, yeah.
yeah, you'll get it. You'll get a
I'll try
a
again.
dedicated
Yeah.
page.
There's a
I was
website.
just there an hour ago, unless it's been taken
I
down.
told myself you got to get a copy of this, so I will persevere.
It is free of charge, yeah.
Excellent.
Here's a, yeah, good.
Excellent.
In the back there, Siobhan?
I think that's so my name's Jeremy. Not my job, but I'm for the National Cathedral, we're working on a project called Water and Wilderness Church, where we have Eucharist at Fletcher's Cove and we bring people outside. And to follow up on that point, I'm the young person advisor on the board, how we get to young people. And the question I was already going to ask before that, to some of the points that were made, is that when we have, it's an Episcopal worship service, of course, and that's great. And there we talk about many of the points that were made about recognizing the beauty of nature, but it isn't very inclusive to other Christian traditions as well as interfaith dialogue. On Friday, me and Zamin were at a house in DuPont Circle called the Abrahamic House, where we had a Shabbat meal. The Abrahamic House is a house where a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim live together. And we were passing around the challah bread, and Zamin and everyone broke off a piece, and Zamin was like, "What is this but communion?" My question, and one other point, we had a conversation at the Abrahamic House on the rise of nuns attracting to things like Soul Cycle. I was at the National Prayer Breakfast after party, and all these evangelicals were asking about incarnational practices, centering prayer, Shabbat. From people who used to be very Gnostic, there's an interest now, maybe because of technology, in incarnational practices. Each one of our traditions is rich in rituals. How do we cultivate rituals that different interfaith settings? I forget if it was this panel, from Henry Now, and hospitalities, not to change people, but to create a place where people can change. How can we have rituals within our own tradition? How do we approach creating rituals that encourage the sharing of sacred spaces, specifically in this context?
So thank you for that question, and maybe this can be the last question. I'll broaden it a little bit to relate to questions of lived religion, how people live together through ritual, through community. I think it builds a nice bridge back to the way we began this afternoon, hearing from practitioners, activists, Laura and Fakhruddin in Peru and Indonesia, and the struggles of those communities on the ground. We've sort of ascended, if you like, into talking about a document and deep theological ideas, but let's return to the issue of practice and community. Any thoughts about how the impulses from this document can link back to lived religion and sharing, and that's one way to carry forward or to move from values to impact? Yeah.
Well, perhaps now we talked about Amazon and Google. Now Al-Mizan can be on the cloud. Al-Mizan can be also transformed into simple narratives for youth and to have an impact. I think the idea of simplifying our jargon, as I just mentioned before, is a critical, especially for the younger generation, and how we can bring case studies and what I call living labs. How Al-Mizan can be transformed into a certified academy for short summer courses, a summer camp. How can it be on a mass open online course, or how can it be a living lab for exploration and co-creation between different cultures? How can Al-Mizan be part of a peace park in the Middle East, so people can celebrate diversity and appreciate human freedom, human dignity, etc., etc. So I think many forms of Al-Mizan can be, whether it's on the cloud, or whether it's a peace park, or whether it's on Reels or a Wikipedia, so I think different forms of communication is critical, especially for the young, wider audience.
Very good. Yeah, Laurel? Yeah.
I'm struck by your question. I'll speak within the U.S. context. The folks who identify as religious nuns, it's spiritual but not religious is often the case. And so I think the first thing we have to reckon with is that our traditions have turned off a lot of people because of exactly this issue. That's why I left evangelicalism, because they weren't speaking to this, even though I soon found they were. So I think if we're trying to reach a group that is already saying, I don't trust religious institutions, then we need to exactly go to the places like you're going, take it outside, take it into different forms, let communities start forming those rituals as opposed to our telling them these are the religious rituals. So it's an incredible space for creativity, as long as we are willing to let go, those of us who are within religious institutions, let go, listen.
Thank you. Any final thoughts, Vin?
Well, just to add to that, interfaith work in the environment should include those of no faith as well.
But they're spiritual. Maybe.
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 I would want to
Faith
say
and-
that, but
faith
maybe
and spirituality aren't the
let's
same.
keep it completely
Right.
open and let people
Right.
share. If the focus is
Right.
nature, how does this make you feel?
Yeah.
And the similarities may be mind-blowing. But yeah, using nature as a tool for creating a deeper connection between humanity, even when faith is not the term at hand, might be an option.
Thank you. Final word, Munjid?
I'd say that, well, for one, just, I guess, just 2 points. What institutions do, going back to institutionalization, is that it helps to make sure that something's not just a conference that happened 1 year and it's gone, but that there's energy, there's dedicated to this topic and ensures that it keeps on going. But aside from that, it really comes to respond to both Jocelyn's and this young man's questions. Young man, I'm like 2 years older than you, but although I don't look. The tradition as a word is often misunderstood as being something that's just a museum piece, but it's a living organism, and if it is to live, it has to respond to the problems of the times. Responded to the problems of the 12th century, back in the 12th century, should respond to the problems of the 21st century in the 21st century. And so many people get turned off by religion because it hasn't responded to the problems of the times. And so for the sake of even religious tradition itself, there has to be a response to the environmental crisis in a way that is genuine and thorough.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fitting that we ended the conversation with you all bringing in the issue of how people outside any religious tradition relate to these questions. It's been an exciting opportunity to reflect on the importance of Al-Mizan, which I think is a historic document, just a couple of months old. We'll be able to accompany it and support, hopefully, the efforts to spread that message as part of this project that we're a part of. And we invite you all to accompany the project as we move forward. I want to thank you for spending the afternoon with us. Let you know that we have a nice reception prepared. We hope you'll stick around and continue the conversation informally. In conclusion, I want to thank the Berkley Center team, Imogene Johnson, Siobhan Cooney, for your help with the event, and ask you all to thank our panel as well.